From cave wall hands to the printing press, empires rose in a giant mess. Silk road spice and a compass spin. Humans kept inventing trouble again. A pharaoh blinked and a kingdom fell. Romans built roads and aqueducts well. Mongols rode through half the earth, changing maps for what it's worth. We mapped the stars, crossed every sea, argued on what gods could be. Trade, revolt, philosophy, history's one big conspiracy. It all started with a buffer. Wait! The Buffer History Podcast, where timelines crash and cultures talk back. From Delhi courts to Viking raids to Cold War spies and samurai blades. We got revolutions, treaties, kings, tiny events changing everything. One bad border, one coup, one chart, and suddenly the whole world falls apart. So gather round, don't lose the plot, cause history's way weirder than we were taught. The past ain't dead, it's broadcasting live on Buffer History tonight.
Welcome to the Buffer History Podcast.
Glad to be here for this one.
So I want you to imagine that you are a newly appointed corporate CEO.
Okay, I'm the boss.
Right, you're the boss. And you've been brought in to revitalize this massive, just sprawling company that's been, underperforming for a few years.
Right.
You need to boost worker productivity, kind of jolt the whole company culture awake.
Makes sense.
Now, imagine that your very first strategic move, like right out of the gate, is to intentionally burn down your most profitable flagship store.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. A division that brings in a third of your total revenue. And you do this on purpose.
Just completely torch it.
Exactly. Under the assumption that without it, your employees will somehow, work harder.
It sounds like absolute madness.
It sounds like corporate suicide, right?
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is, in 1985, this wasn't some hypothetical boardroom blunder.
No, it wasn't.
It was the exact strategy deployed by the leadership of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, they literally took a sledgehammer to their own economy in this desperate bid to save it.
It's wild. And today, our mission is to explore this whole historical crime scene for you.
Right.
We're going to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, not as some dusty textbook history, but really as a gripping political thriller.
Because that's really what it is.
Yeah.
And that corporate analogy you used is eerily accurate.
Right.
But to really grasp the scale of the shockwaves that move caused, you have to rewind just a few years earlier.
To the early 80s.
Right, and look at the sheer, undeniable gravity of the Soviet state. Because to an average citizen living in Moscow or Kiev in 1980, the idea that this empire was standing on the edge of a cliff would have sounded like science fiction.
That's the thing that always strikes me about the 1980s. When we think about the USSR at that specific moment, there was this profound, almost suffocating sense of invincibility.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it is the absolute peak of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is projecting total global dominance.
They're everywhere.
Right. They are hosting the Summer Olympics in Moscow, using it as this massive, glittering showcase of socialist prestige to the world.
And financially, they're flush with cash.
Exactly. Global oil prices are soaring at historic highs, hovering around like $120 a barrel.
Which was unprecedented.
Yeah. And they have this massive, heavily armed military apparatus that has effectively reached parity with the United States.
Right. They had caught up.
And at the helm, you have Leonid Brezhnev, who, provides this deeply entrenched, albeit incredibly boring, stability.
Boring is a good word for it.
Right. For all intents and purposes, it looked like a colossal empire that would easily outlast the century.
It really did. To any outside observer, and frankly to most people living within it, the Soviet system in 1980 had achieved what the Communist Party officially termed developed socialism.
Okay, I always hear that phrase tossed around in these historical discussions.
Yeah, developed socialism.
What did that actually mean to, the person waiting for a bus in Leningrad? Sounds like just another bureaucratic buzzword.
Well, it was essentially an unwritten social contract.
Okay.
It was a pivot away from the utopian, revolutionary fervor of the early Soviet days.
Right, the 1920s and 30s.
Exactly. Back then, the promise was that true, perfect communism was just around the corner, provided everyone sacrificed and suffered for the future.
Right, just hold on a little longer.
Yeah, but by Brezhnev's era, developed socialism was the state's way of saying, well, we might not reach that perfect utopia anytime soon, but we have built a stable, functioning society. Living standards were genuinely up from the post-war years.
I mean, they had to rebuild everything after the war.
Right. The acute housing shortages of the past had been somewhat addressed with massive blocks of prefabricated apartments.
The famous concrete blocks.
Yeah, exactly. Bread was practically free. You were guaranteed a job.
Right.
And the regime felt permanent because the day-to-day reality, while lacking, luxury or political freedom, was predictable and secure.
But then we fast forward just a single decade.
Right.
And this absolute titan of a superpower just vanishes.
Overnight, practically.
It dissolves.
Yeah.
And here's the kicker for you. This wasn't the result of some catastrophic foreign invasion.
Yeah.
There were no foreign boots marching on Moscow,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no bloody, nation-spanning civil war tearing the geography apart.
The state simply evaporated.
Right. So how does a heavily armed superpower just dissolve? Who killed it? Who actively tried to save it?
And could it even be saved?
Exactly. And to conduct this historical investigation, we are relying on some incredibly meticulous research from leading historians.
Right. We're diving deep into Vladislav M. Zubak's collapse, the fall of the Soviet Union,
Great one.
and Chris Miller's The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy,
Also fantastic.
and Sheila Fitzpatrick's The Shortest History of the Soviet Union.
Right. These authors aren't just giving us a dry timeline. They provide the exact financial ledgers, the paranoid backroom political maneuvering.
Real thriller stuff.
Yeah, and the psychological breaking points of the individuals who are standing at the wheel as the entire Soviet ship went down.
So let's set the stage.
Let's do it.
The year is 1985. The stagnation of the Brezhnev era is coming to a close because the old guard is quite literally dying off.
Right. Brezhnev passes away, followed in rapid, almost comical succession by Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko.
It was a true gerontocracy.
Exactly. And into this stagnant, aging bureaucracy enters our flawed protagonist, Mikhail Gorbachev.
He takes power in March 1985 as the General Secretary of the Communist Party.
And he is vastly younger than his predecessors.
Right.
He's energetic, he smiles for the cameras, and he inherits this immense, terrifying apparatus of power.
But he also inherits a slowing, wheezing economy.
Yeah.
An economy that has become dangerously, perhaps fatally reliant on those high oil export revenues we mentioned.
Right. Now, the crucial thing to understand about Gorbachev's mindset is that he doesn't view himself as a bankruptcy manager brought in to liquidate a failing firm.
No, not at all.
He sees himself as a turnaround specialist. He genuinely believes the socialist system can be saved, it just needs to be reinvigorated.
And that psychological baseline is essential. Gorbachev looks at the Soviet Union and sees a highly educated population.
Right. Incredible human capital.
Exactly. Human capital that is being entirely wasted by a sclerotic bureaucracy and terrible labor discipline.
Because he was an agricultural expert by training. Right. And he had actually traveled to the West.
He had. He saw the stark disparity. He looks at the global economy shifting towards high-tech industries, computing, advanced manufacturing.
Yeah.
And he realizes the USSR cannot survive just by pumping crude oil out of Siberia and churning out low-value-added, heavy industrial goods.
Right. They can't just be a giant gas station forever.
Exactly. He needs to wake the country up, violently if necessary, from its long, comfortable slumber.
Which brings us back to that CEO burning down the flagship store.
Right.
Because to wake the country up, Gorbachev and his conservative deputy in the Politburo, Yegor Ligachev, decide they need to tackle the most glaring social and productivity issue right out of the gate.
The legendary endemic Soviet drinking problem.
Yeah. In May 1985, they launch a massive, draconian anti-alcohol campaign.
And when you say massive...
I mean a full-scale war on vodka. They are slashing liquor licenses across the empire.
Just cutting them off.
They are physically bringing in bulldozers to tear up pristine, centuries-old selection vineyards in Crimea and the Caucasus.
Oh, wow.
It gets worse. They are letting state-of-the-art new brewing equipment, imported at great cost from Czechoslovakia, just sit in the rain and rust.
That's just throwing money away.
Literally.
Yeah.
Police are actively pulling drunks off the streets and throwing them into sobering-up stations.
Well, we have to acknowledge the very real, very grim reality that motivated this extreme measure, though.
Right. It wasn't just for fun.
No. The social consequences of alcoholism in the Soviet Union at this time were devastating.
Yep.
It was a full-blown demographic crisis. Male life expectancy was actually dropping in a supposedly developed, industrialized nation.
Which is historically incredibly rare.
Very rare. But Gorbachev and Ligachev weren't just looking at this as a public health initiative. It was a macroeconomic lever. Chris Miller's The struggle to save the Soviet economy points out an astounding, almost unbelievable statistic.
Okay, let's hear it.
Roughly 90% of missed work days in the Soviet Union at this time were caused by drinking.
90%.
90%. Workers were showing up to the factories drunk, drinking on the job, or simply not showing up at all because they were hungover.
That is insane.
So the leadership believed that if they sobered up the workforce, labor productivity would organically skyrocket.
Just giving the sluggish command economy the jolt it desperately needed.
Exactly.
Okay, I understand the logic of wanting a sober workforce, obviously, but let's really unpack the mechanics of this move.
Let's do it.
Because the Soviet state operated as a massive, centralized monopoly. They controlled everything, including the production and sale of alcohol.
Right.
So to fix the economy, their very first macroeconomic policy was to intentionally destroy their own most profitable revenue stream.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did.
It seems completely counterintuitive. How much was the state actually relying on vodka sales to keep the lights on?
Well, the state's reliance on alcohol was staggering. It was a structural addiction that mirrored the population's.
Okay.
What's fascinating here is the sheer catastrophic financial magnitude of this miscalculation.
Give me the numbers.
The tax on alcohol, the turnover tax, procured roughly 1/3 of the entire Soviet state budget at the time.
1/3.
1/3. Prior to the 1985 campaign, liquor made up 16% of all retail sales in the entire country.
Wow.
The state practically funded its military and its social safety net by selling cheap vodka to its own citizens.
That's a dark cycle.
In Miller's book, we see the devastating math laid out plainly. Official vodka sales plummeted from 54 billion rubles in 1984 down to 11 billion rubles by 1986.
Wait, from 54 billion down to 11 billion? That is a massive drop.
Massive. By trying to cure the social ill, they ripped a huge, unfillable hole right in the center of the Soviet treasury.
Unbelievable.
And the financial loss from this self-inflicted wound was practically identical in scale to the catastrophic drop in global oil prices they were about to face.
It's astounding. They basically amputated a limb to cure a limb.
That's a great way to put it.
And sure, the public health metrics temporarily improved, right? Like, male mortality did actually drop by roughly 25% during the campaign.
True.
But they instantly bankrupted the state treasury to achieve it. Plus, from a human perspective, they infuriated the populace.
No, absolutely.
People didn't stop drinking. They just shifted to the black market.
Right. They started brewing illegal moonshine or samagon in their bathtubs.
Which led to massive shortages of sugar across the country, right?
Yes, because everyone was buying it up to ferment alcohol.
It was a cascading failure. The state lost the tax revenue. The people spent their time waiting in massive lines for whatever legal alcohol was left instead of actually working.
And the black market absorbed all the profits. It was an unmitigated disaster for state capacity.
Okay, so just as the Soviet leadership is reeling from this massive, entirely self-inflicted loss of revenue, the narrative delivers its first massive, unpredictable twist.
The Black Swan event.
April 26, 1986. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
Right. The explosion of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It took the entire Soviet scientific, military, and bureaucratic establishment completely by surprise.
Which is saying something for a state that prides itself on knowing everything.
Exactly. It was a failure of technology, but more profoundly a failure of the culture of secrecy that defined the Soviet system.
Right.
Vladislav M. Zubok's collapse vividly details the sheer terror of those days. He notes how the frantic flight of hundreds of thousands of people from Kiev and the surrounding areas.
Yeah, just the sheer mass panic of displaced citizens moving on trains and roads.
Right. He says it was highly reminiscent of scenes from World War II.
I can't even imagine.
The government had to throw absolutely everything it had at taming this invisible nuclear monster.
They hastily evacuated a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, right?
Yeah, and they had to physically scrape away and bury contaminated soil. They mobilized the military, miners, and engineers in a desperate, deadly cleanup operation involving hundreds of thousands of liquidators.
Okay, so the financial cost of mobilizing an army to fight a nuclear fire must have been astronomical.
Oh, it was.
Especially for a treasury that just lost its primary source of domestic retail income from the vodka ban.
Staggering is almost an understatement. Zubok notes that in just the first month alone, the immediate emergency cost to the Soviet budget was 3 billion rubles.
3 billion in 1 month.
And that was just the initial bleeding. Prime Minister Nikolai Rezhkov later estimated the total long-term cost to the state to be about 8 billion rubles.
8 billion.
Yeah, Ryzhkov openly called it a sudden and devastating blow to our convalescent economy.
Because they had to build a massive concrete sarcophagus, relocate entire cities, and compensate victims.
All while revenue was plummeting.
But with Chernobyl, the money's almost secondary to the psychological toll, right?
Oh, without a doubt.
Soviet Union based its entire ideological legitimacy on scientific superiority and infallible central planning.
Right.
This reactor blowing up didn't just irradiate the countryside. It shattered the aura of invincibility.
The psychological impact was arguably the most fatal radiation of all.
How so?
Well, Zubok points out a very telling, intimate detail regarding this. Raisa Gorbacheva, the general secretary's wife, and his closest confidant.
Yeah.
She was nominally an atheist, as all good communists were supposed to be, but she was deeply superstitious.
Really?
Yeah, and she viewed Chernobyl as a terrible, dark omen, a curse on her husband's reign.
Wow.
And the wider public, who were largely kept in the dark during the initial days of the disaster, they felt the exact same way.
Because the state tried to hide it at first.
Right. But when the radioactive cloud drifted over Europe and the state could no longer hide it, the trust in the regime just evaporated.
I felt betrayed.
Citizens began to whisper darkly that Gorbachev, with the prominent, distinctive birthmark on his forehead, was a stained leader who brought misfortune and death to the empire.
That's chilling. And the fact that Gorbachev himself didn't address the stunned, terrified nation on television until May 14th.
Nearly 3 weeks after the explosion?
Right. 3 weeks of silence. That severely tarnished his authority. He looked completely paralyzed.
3 weeks of silence while rumors of a nuclear apocalypse are spreading through the populace.
That is a massive failure of leadership. But what blows my mind is how Gorbachev processes this internally.
It's very revealing.
Because as the crisis unfolds and the dust literally settles, he doesn't pull back into a conservative shell, right?
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't decide to just batten down the hatches and weather the storm. He doubles down on changing the system.
And this is perhaps the most crucial psychological turning point for Gorbachev in the entire narrative.
Okay, walk me through it.
Well, the natural instinct of a Soviet bureaucrat would be to cover it up, punish a few scapegoats, and reinforce the existing power structures.
That's what they always did.
But Gorbachev's reaction was deeply ideological. He was furious at the incompetence, the lies told by local party bosses, the shoddy construction.
Yeah.
But he used this disaster to jump to a sweeping, almost Leninist conclusion.
Okay, let's pause there, because Leninist conclusion is a heavy phrase. What does it actually mean in practice?
Think back to Lenin in 1917.
Okay.
Lenin didn't believe you could simply reform the Tsarist autocracy or tweak the edges of the provisional government.
Right, he wanted to tear it all down.
He believed the entire old system was inherently rotten, infected beyond saving, and had to be completely smashed and replaced by a vanguard revolution.
Ah, so Gorbachev is looking at his own government that way.
Exactly. Gorbachev, staring at the radioactive ruins of Chernobyl, adopted a similar mindset toward the very system he was leading.
That's a huge shift.
He decided that the Brezhnev-era bureaucracy wasn't just inefficient or slow, it was deeply sick.
Morally and structurally contaminated.
Yes. Chernobyl convinced Gorbachev that minor economic tweaks and anti-alcohol campaigns just wouldn't work anymore.
The country demanded a total radical revolution from within.
Because the old system was literally exploding.
Right.
This psychological shift pushed him away from being a cautious reformer and toward the much more radical, inherently destabilizing political shakeups we see in the late 1980s.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it? The disaster that proved the state was failing became his justification to dismantle the state's safety rails.
It really is.
So let's tally the score for Gorbachev by the end of 1986.
It's not looking good.
He has intentionally wiped out tens of billions of rubles in domestic vodka revenue.
Yeah.
He has been hit with an 8-billion-ruble emergency bill for a catastrophic nuclear meltdown.
Right.
And then the universe decides to pile on. The bottom drops out of the one macroeconomic pillar holding the entire Soviet facade together, oil.
The timing is almost unbelievably cruel for the Soviet leadership.
Yeah.
It's important to understand just how vital oil was. As Sheila Fitzpatrick's The Shortest History of the Soviet Union outlines, the world price of oil had doubled since the mid-1970s.
Hitting those historic highs of $120 a barrel in 1980.
Right. And this wasn't just extra cash. This oil wealth had essentially subsidized the entire stagnation of the Brezhnev years.
Because the Soviet domestic economy was so inefficient at producing consumer goods, right? Or even growing enough grain?
Exactly. They relied heavily on selling crude oil to the West for hard currency, which they then used to import food and basic goods to keep the population pacified.
So oil was the life support machine, hiding the fact that the economic organs were failing.
Precisely. But starting in late 1985 and accelerating violently into 1986, global oil prices plummeted precipitously.
Why? What happened?
Saudi Arabia ramped up production, the global market flooded, and prices crashed down to the $40 range.
From $120 to $40.
The Soviet Union's primary source of foreign currency evaporated almost overnight.
It is a textbook perfect storm. You have the total loss of vodka revenue, the astronomical, unplannable cost of the Chernobyl cleanup, and the total collapse of global oil prices.
All hitting at the exact same time.
The Soviet budget is no longer just running a deficit. It is hemorrhaging cash, bleeding out on the operating table.
And the leadership has no money to subsidize the inefficiencies of the system anymore.
And because they are out of money, they are forced to make drastic structural changes.
Which brings us to the fatal policy choices made between 1987 and 1989, the era where politics and economics collide head-on.
Right. With the economy visibly faltering and the Treasury empty, Gorbachev realizes his initial strategy of just demanding better labor discipline isn't going to cut it.
Sobering up the workers isn't enough.
He needs to drastically restructure the actual mechanics of the system.
So he introduces two sweeping, parallel policies that will come to define his era and ultimately seal the fate of the empire.
Perestroika and Glasnost.
Right. Perestroika, which translates to economic rebuilding or restructuring, and Glasnost, which means openness and transparency, specifically regarding free speech, the press, and the historical record.
Now, anyone who has read a high school history book knows those two words.
They're famous.
But to really understand the magnitude of what Gorbachev did here and why it failed so spectacularly, we have to look at the global context.
Yes, we do.
Because in Chris Miller's The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, there is a brilliant, highly detailed contrast drawn between Gorbachev's strategy in the USSR and Deng Xiaoping's strategy in China.
I'm glad you brought this up.
I want to dig into this because China in the 1980s was facing a very similar existential crossroads.
The comparison between China and the Soviet Union in this era is vital to understanding the mechanics of the collapse.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Both nations were massive, heavily centralized Marxist-Leninist states saddled with bloated, inefficient command economies. Both realized they needed to modernize or perish, but their approaches to saving their respective regimes were diametrically opposed.
Okay, how so?
Deng Xiaoping in China prioritized economic reform above absolutely everything else.
He went all in on the economy.
He aggressively introduced market mechanisms, decollectivized agriculture to allow farmers to sell for profit, and created special economic zones to attract foreign investment. But, and this is the critical divergence, he maintained an absolute iron-fisted monopoly on political power.
Right. Deng allowed free markets, but absolutely no free speech.
Exactly. When Chinese citizens, empowered by the new economic freedoms, began to demand political liberalization and democracy.
Deng's regime ruthlessly crushed them.
Yes, most notably and tragically at Tiananmen Square in 1989.
Right.
For Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese Communist Party, authoritarian stability was the non-negotiable prerequisite for economic growth.
You fix the economy first, using the unquestioned power of the state to force the bitter medicine down.
And you do not allow the populace to debate the dosage.
But Gorbachev does the exact opposite.
He pushes political democratization first.
He unleashes Glasnost,
Yes.
He lifts censorship, allows independent political clubs to form, and encourages the press to investigate state corruption.
And he does this not out of a purely noble desire for human rights, right?
Right. It's a calculated political weapon. He is hoping that by freeing the press and allowing public criticism, the newly empowered citizens will help him dislodge the stubborn, conservative bureaucrats who are blocking his economic reforms.
He wants to use the public as a battering ram against his own government.
It was a massive gamble, and it raises a fundamental historical question. Why was this such a fatal miscalculation?
Well, by introducing Glasnost before securing the economy, Gorbachev completely shattered the ideological legitimacy of the Soviet state.
The state lost its aura.
For 70 years, the Communist Party's monopoly on power was justified by its claim to absolute historical truth and infallibility.
They were the vanguard.
Suddenly, under Glasnost, A public that had been heavily censored for decades was allowed to read about the horrific world historical crimes of the Stalin era.
The gulags, the forced famines, the purges.
Exactly. They were allowed to read exposés on the catastrophic environmental disasters hidden by the state and the sheer mind-numbing incompetence and corruption of the current local party bosses.
And the press, freed by Gorbachev to attack his conservative rivals, didn't stop there.
No, they began to attack the very foundations of the Marxist-Leninist system itself.
Totally eroded whatever residual faith the public had left in the system.
Sheila Fitzpatrick's The Shortest History of the Soviet Union spends time exploring the cultural fallout of this.
Yeah, she mentions how this immense disconnect between the state's soaring rhetoric and the grim reality on the ground birthed a whole genre of cynical, distinctively Soviet political jokes.
Those jokes are legendary.
My favorite one she highlights goes like this. What is the difference between capitalism and socialism? Capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, and socialism is its replacement by its opposite.
That is brilliant and bleak.
It perfectly captures the absurdity the public was feeling. They were being told on television that the system was being perfected.
While they were spending hours standing in the freezing cold, waiting in line for basic groceries.
Glasnost allowed them to finally say the quiet part out loud. The emperor has absolutely no clothes.
Gorbachev genuinely, perhaps naively, believed that telling the truth would purify and strengthen socialism.
He thought an informed public would be a loyal, energized public.
Instead, the sudden flood of historical trauma and present-day economic misery terrified the public.
It destroyed the unifying myth of the Soviet identity.
And rapidly mobilized virulent anti-communist and separatist nationalist movements in the republics.
In the Baltics, in the Caucasus, in Ukraine.
But to understand why Gorbachev felt he had to resort to using democratization as a weapon, we have to look at the immense, paralyzing gridlock caused by the Soviet interest groups inside the Kremlin.
I'm glad you brought that up. Because if I'm listening to this and I hear that Gorbachev is the General Secretary of the Communist Party.
Right, the supreme leader.
The supreme leader of a totalitarian superpower, I'm naturally going to think, if he wants economic changes, why doesn't he just mandate them? He's the boss.
It seems obvious.
Right. Why couldn't he just slash the bloated military budget by decree?
Yeah.
Exactly like Deng Xiaoping did in China.
That is the logical assumption drawn from how we view dictatorships. But the reality inside the labyrinth of the Kremlin was very different.
Okay.
As Chris Miller explains in The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, the economic interest groups in the Soviet Union, specifically the massive military-industrial complex and the entrenched agricultural lobbies, they were vastly more powerful, institutionalized, and independent than their counterparts in China.
They were states within the state.
In China, Deng Xiaoping was a veteran revolutionary commander. He had the personal authority and military credibility to immediately slash the defense budget upon taking power.
Proving the civilian party definitively controlled the gun.
But Gorbachev didn't have that pedigree.
He was a career party apparatchik, an agricultural administrator.
Yes. Well, Gorbachev had no military background. In the Soviet Union, the military and the KGB were so dominant, so structurally insulated from civilian oversight, that an astonishing fact emerges.
I love this detail, tell him.
Before Gorbachev became general secretary, even when he was a top senior member of the ruling Politburo, he wasn't even allowed to see the full details of the national defense budget.
Let that sink in.
It was considered highly classified military intelligence, kept hidden from the civilian leadership that was supposed to be running the country.
He is one of the top 12 guys in the entire global empire, sitting at the absolute pinnacle of political power, and the generals tell him, sorry, comrade, you don't have the security clearance to see how we spend the country's money.
It's wild.
It completely shifts our understanding of who was really running the show. The military-industrial complex wasn't just a sector of the economy, it essentially owned the economy.
Precisely. Gorbachev was completely boxed in by these institutional behemoths.
He knew mathematically that the massive subsidies going to wildly inefficient collective farms and the bloated military-industrial complex were bankrupting the country.
The military alone, according to some estimates, accounted for roughly 1/5 to 1/4 of overall economic production.
It was a black hole for resources.
But he simply didn't have the political muscle or the institutional authority to cut their funding by fiat.
The generals and the agricultural bosses would have just removed him from power.
So his desperate gamble with Glasnost and the creation of new, democratically elected legislative bodies was an intricate flanking maneuver.
He wanted to use the outrage and the voice of the newly freed people to legitimately strip the military and the agricultural bosses of their power and funding.
Exactly. I can't cut your budget, but maybe this angry mob of voters can. That's the logic.
But instead of breaking the gridlock and clearing the way for smooth economic transition, this political warfare just paralyzed the central government.
The center lost its ability to dictate terms to anyone.
And while the political system is effectively paralyzing itself in this tug of war, Gorbachev pushes through what are supposed to be his economic saving graces.
The crown jewels of Perestroika.
Specifically, the 1988 law on state enterprises and the law on cooperatives.
Right. Let's really dig into the mechanics of these laws.
Because this is the moment where the Soviet economy stops stagnating and literally begins to rip itself apart at the seams.
The 1988 law on state enterprises was the masterstroke of Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhikov and his team of reformist economists.
Okay.
They recognized the system was deeply inefficient, but they were ideologically terrified of full capitalism.
Cool, of course.
They wanted to inject the motivating dynamics of a free market without actually relinquishing state ownership.
Which is a tricky balance.
Very. They conceptualized this through a policy they called the 3 S's: self-accounting, self-financing, and self-governance.
Okay, let's ground this in reality for you listening. Put us on the factory floor. What did the 3 S's actually mean for, say, a massive state factory producing shoes in the Ural Mountains?
Good example.
How did it operate in 1984, and how did this law change it in 1988?
Under the old classic command economy of 1984, that shoe factory in the Urals had zero autonomy.
Right.
Central planners in Moscow would dictate every single detail. You will produce 100,000 pairs of black boots this year. We will provide you with exactly this much leather and rubber. You will pay your workers this exact state-mandated wage.
And you will hand over all the finished boots to the state distribution network.
Exactly. Whether the boots were good, bad, or utterly unwearable didn't matter. The factory manager's only goal was to hit the numerical quota.
If he did, the state funded the factory.
Yes.
A completely closed, insulated loop with zero incentive for quality or efficiency.
Right. Now, enter the 1988 law and the 3 S's.
Things change.
In theory, the state was handing control of the enterprise over to its management and the newly empowered workers' collective. Okay.
Under the new rules, the factory would still have to fulfill a state order, a baseline contract, to ensure basic societal needs were met.
Sure.
But after that quota was hit, the factory could operate for its own profit.
They could independently find suppliers, take out bank credits,
Decide how to spend their surplus money, and most importantly, retain a significant portion of their profits.
and the most radical, ideologically driven change under the banner of self-governance was that the head of the enterprise was no longer a party loyalist appointed from above by Moscow.
The manager was now elected directly by the factory workers themselves.
From a purely democratic socialist standpoint, it sounds incredibly empowering.
It does.
You are literally giving the means of production back to the workers. They elect their boss, they share in the profits. On paper, what could possibly go wrong?
Absolutely everything.
Why?
Because they removed the old iron-fisted coercive control mechanisms of the command economy, but they utterly failed to implement the harsh discipline of a true free market.
Like the threat of bankruptcy or true price competition. Exactly. Think about the perverse incentives this created. If you are a factory manager who has just been democratically elected by your workers, and you now have the power to keep and distribute the profits your factory generates, what is your immediate priority?
Well, if I want to keep my job, and I want to keep the thousands of people who just voted for me happy, I'm going to pay them as much money as humanly possible.
Right.
I'm going to raise wages across the board.
And that is exactly what happened across the entire Soviet Union. As Vladislav M. Zubok notes in Collapse, the macroeconomic results were the exact catastrophic opposite of what the Kremlin reformers intended.
The center hoped that factories would take their new retained profits and invest them in high-tech equipment to increase efficiency or improve the quality of their goods.
Instead, the elected managers and workers' collectives just pocketed the cash. They drastically maximized their own wages and bonuses.
But wait, if they're paying themselves more, they have to be making higher profits. How are they increasing their profit margins if the overall economy is still so sluggish?
By entirely manipulating the production lines. Because they were now focused on the ruble value of their output rather than strict physical quotas, they completely stopped producing the cheap, affordable, low-margin consumer goods that the vast majority of the Soviet population relied on for survival.
I see. They realize, why should our factory break its back making 10,000 pairs of cheap, affordable children's boots that yield a tiny profit margin?
Right.
When we can use the same amount of state-subsidized leather to make 1,000 pairs of high-end, expensive luxury boots, do a fraction of the actual labor, and pay ourselves double the wages from the inflated revenue.
That is the exact mechanism. State factories essentially went on strike against the needs of the consumer.
Wow.
They chased high-margin goods, which meant the production of everyday essentials completely collapsed.
And to compound this disaster, Gorbachev introduces the second pillar, the law on cooperatives.
This law essentially legalized small-scale private businesses for the first time in decades.
Restaurants, repair shops, small manufacturers.
But because the overall macroeconomy was still plagued by rigid, state-controlled, artificially low prices for raw materials, these new private cooperatives quickly mutated into massive, parasitic arbitrage operations.
Okay, let's break down that arbitrage. How did a cooperative bleed the state?
Imagine you open a private furniture cooperative.
Okay.
The state still heavily subsidizes raw materials, so you use your connections to buy up huge quantities of state-subsidized lumber or steel at dirt-cheap, artificially fixed official prices.
Right.
But because you are a private cooperative, you aren't bound by state retail prices when you sell your finished product.
So you take that cheap state lumber, build a table, and sell it on the newly legalized free market.
Or the black market.
At massive exorbitant markups.
So they're basically siphoning cheap resources out of the state sector, converting them into private profit, and giving nothing back to the state treasury.
Exactly. The wealth of the state was being legally funneled into private pockets.
So let's look at the macroeconomic board right now.
It's a mess.
The state treasury is bleeding resources to these arbitrage cooperatives. The massive state enterprises are jacking up workers' wages astronomically while simultaneously producing far fewer essential goods.
And because these newly autonomous factories are hoarding their cash to pay those wages, tax revenues flowing back to the central government plummet.
So the central government in Moscow is sitting there watching its tax base vanish.
But they still have the massive bills to pay. They still have to fund the Red Army, the nuclear arsenal, the KGB, and the massive agricultural subsidies that keep bread prices artificially low.
How on earth does the center react to this?
They panicked.
They really did.
As Chris Miller details meticulously, the Kremlin lost control of the country's finances, with regional governments and massive enterprises hoarding their cash, refusing to remit taxes to Moscow.
And consumer inflation beginning to run rampant.
The central government faced a devastating shortfall. Miller notes they faced a 100 billion ruble deficit just in the funds required to maintain basic food subsidies.
To plug this massive existential hole, the Kremlin resorted to the oldest, most destructive trick in the economic playbook.
They turned on the printing press.
They just started printing rubles to cover the gap.
In massive, unprecedented quantities. In 1990, the central bank was forced to print 28.4 billion rubles just to keep the government functioning.
And by 1991, as the central authority completely dissolved and tax collection effectively ceased, that infusion of newly printed money skyrocketed to 93.4 billion rubles.
If they just print money with no actual economic growth to back it up, the currency becomes functionally worthless.
Exactly. So farmers stop wanting to sell their grain to the state for worthless rubles, which means food stops making it to the cities.
That is the exact downward spiral we see. And this brings up a brilliant analogy for what was happening institutionally.
There's like a massive bank run.
Right. But instead of average retail citizens lining up outside a branch to pull out their savings accounts, it's an institutional bank run.
It's the regional governments, the ethnic republics like Ukraine and the Baltics, and the powerful factory bosses pulling out of the Soviet state apparatus itself.
They look at Moscow, they realize the center is politically weak and financially bankrupt, so everyone grabs whatever tangible assets and power they can before the whole overarching structure collapses.
That is the perfect way to visualize it, an institutional bank run.
And the flood of printed money destroyed the value of the ruble. The paper savings of the Soviet population grew exponentially in their bank accounts, but they were suddenly just worthless numbers.
And when a state can no longer ensure its most basic fundamental function, maintaining a stable medium of exchange, it is mathematically bound to fall apart.
Which launches us into Act 3, The climax in the fall.
We are now in the agonizing years of 1990 and 1991. The ticking clock is deafening.
Hyperinflation is utterly destroying the daily economy. The black markets and the cooperatives are thriving, dealing in barter or foreign currency.
But the official state store shelves are terrifyingly physically empty.
Miller's book highlights a statistic that captures the micro-human misery of this macro collapse. By April 1991, only 12% of people surveyed across the country ever even saw sausage available in state stores.
12%.
Butter, flour, basic staples gone. The distribution networks have completely frozen.
We have to ground this in the human experience to understand the political stakes.
Yeah, put us there.
We are talking about citizens of a nuclear superpower spending 4, 5, 6 hours a day standing in freezing lines, holding rationing coupons that are rendered completely worthless because there's simply nothing to buy.
The social contract of developed socialism wasn't just broken, it was shattered.
And in this immense vacuum of power, economic chaos, and public fury, a counter-elite rapidly rises to fill the void.
Most prominently, a man named Boris Yeltsin.
Yeltsin is such an incredible, chaotic figure in this narrative.
He really is. He had been a top Soviet leader, the party boss of Moscow, but he was publicly fired and humiliated by Gorbachev in 1987 for pushing reforms too fast.
But instead of fading into obscurity, he engineers perhaps the most brilliant populist political comeback of the 20th century.
Yeltsin realizes that the Soviet Union as a centralized entity is a sinking ship. So he doesn't try to take over the whole ship.
He aims for the biggest lifeboat.
Exactly. He gets himself democratically elected to lead the Russian Republic, which is the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful component of the Soviet Union.
And from that newly legitimate platform, Yeltsin actively, aggressively works to hollow out Gorbachev's remaining central authority.
He declares that Russian laws supersede Soviet laws.
He tells the autonomous regions within Russia to take as much sovereignty as you can swallow.
He and his democratic reformers realize that if they can't take over the Kremlin from Gorbachev, they will just seize the Russian ministries, the Russian resources, and let the rest of the Soviet Union simply fall away.
So Gorbachev is completely trapped. He is a president without a country.
He is desperately trying to negotiate a new union treaty with the various republic leaders, a treaty that would essentially dissolve the old centralized Soviet state and turn it into a loose, decentralized federation.
Hoping to keep at least some semblance of unity.
But the hardliners in his own government, the military men, the spies, the old-school bureaucrats, decide they have seen enough.
They believe Gorbachev's new treaty will be the final nail in the coffin of the state they spent their lives serving.
So we arrive at the flashpoint.
Yeah.
August 1991,
Right.
the August coup, the desperate, violent attempt to save the empire by force.
The men who plotted this coup were not fringe extremists. They were the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of the Soviet security and economic establishment.
Right. You have Vladimir Khrushchev, the head of the dreaded KGB.
Dmitry Yazov, the minister of defense who commanded millions of troops.
Valentin Pavlov, the prime minister and former finance minister.
And Oleg Baklanov, the head of the sprawling military-industrial complex.
These were the men who physically controlled the guns, the spies, the factories, and the money.
And despite their terrifying titles, there's this almost absurd, dark comedy thriller detail from Zubok's Collapse regarding how they planned this operation.
I love this detail.
This cabal of men plotting the violent overthrow of a nuclear superpower didn't hatch their master plan in some sleek, underground, high-tech bunker.
No. They all belonged to the exact same Joshua cooperative in the elite suburbs near Moscow.
They owned neighboring vacation homes.
The plot to save the Soviet Union from collapse was quite literally hashed out over backyard fences and evening walks in an exclusive, gated suburban community.
It's a detail that perfectly illustrates how deeply disconnected these aging bureaucrats were from the explosive reality on the streets.
On August 18th, they make their move. They send a delegation of generals and KGB officers to Gorbachev's isolated summer home in Crimea, demanding he declare a nationwide state of emergency and hand over power.
When Gorbachev angrily refuses, they cut his communication lines, take away his nuclear briefcase, effectively locking him under house arrest.
And they seize power in Moscow.
The newly formed State Committee on the State of Emergency rolls columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers right into the streets of the capital.
Imagine the sheer, visceral terror and the stakes of that moment. You are a citizen in Moscow. You wake up, you look outside your window, and there are tanks idling at the intersections.
You turn on the state television, and instead of the news, they are broadcasting a continuous loop of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake.
The classic Soviet signal that a leader has died or a coup is underway.
The president is missing. The military and the KGB have taken over. The entire world holds its breath, terrified that we're about to see a massive, bloody civil war in a nation armed with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons.
I bet.
Tension breaks almost immediately.
The coup falls apart in just 3 days. Yeltsin famously escapes arrest, goes down to the Parliament building, the White House, stands defiant on top of a tank, and rallies tens of thousands of Muscovites to build barricades.
But the historical question remains, why did the coup fail so spectacularly?
With the entire legendary might of the KGB and the Red Army at their disposal, how do these men lose their empire in just 72 hours?
This is where Chris Miller's analysis in The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy provides the crucial underlying structural answer.
Okay, weigh it out.
The coup plotters, the junta, looked at China and wanted that Chinese-style discipline.
Right.
They wanted to institute martial law, crush the democratic dissenters, roll back the economic chaos, and physically force the country back to work.
But they were fundamentally, psychologically unwilling to accept the brutal, horrifying consequences that strategy actually demanded in the Soviet context.
Because cracking down wasn't just about arresting politicians, it was about the economy. What would forcing the country back to work have actually required?
It would require mass famine.
Exactly. Because the agricultural supply chains and distribution networks had totally collapsed, the major cities were rapidly running out of food.
If the junta had enforced strict authoritarian austerity and forcibly redirected resources away from consumer subsidies to balance the state budget, it would have literally starved Moscow and Leningrad.
These men weren't Stalin. They were conservative, gray-suited bureaucrats, and when push came to shove, they simply didn't have the stomach to inflict mass casualties and starvation on their own capital city.
But the deeper, more fatal structural flaw was entirely economic.
Right, because they are trying to use the military to save an economy that the military itself bankrupted.
Exactly. The irony is profound. The military generals and the heavy industry bosses launched the coup to save the state, but they were the very interest groups draining the budget dry.
The military-industrial complex was the black hole swallowing the Soviet economy.
The only way a military coup could have mathematically solved the USSR's economic crisis was if the military seized absolute power and then immediately slashed its own defense budget by 60 or 70% to free up cash.
And that was obviously never going to happen.
They were the primary cause of the bankruptcy, pretending to be the cure.
Because they lacked a cohesive, viable economic plan, their political authority simply evaporated. The elite KGB Alpha Group refused orders to storm the parliament.
The tank commanders refused to fire on their own people. The plotters' hands were famously shaking on national television.
It was a collapse of will.
So the coup fails, the plotters are arrested, and the tanks withdraw. But in their desperate, heavy-handed attempt to save the Communist Party and the centralized Soviet state, the hardliners inadvertently dealt in a lethal finishing blow.
By showing exactly how weak, divided, and powerless the center truly was, they gave Yeltsin the perfect, unassailable excuse to aggressively dismantle whatever institutional framework was left.
The aftermath of the August coup is a stunningly rapid, almost unbelievable unraveling of a superpower.
As Zubak describes it, it was a total political meltdown. The conspirators effectively surrendered the executive branch of the central government entirely.
Gorbachev is freed and returns to Moscow from Crimea, but he returns as a ghost.
He is still technically the president, but he is the president of a country that functionally no longer exists.
Yeltsin and his Russian reformers immediately, ruthlessly sweep in and take over the Central Soviet ministries.
They take over the state treasury, they take over the foreign ministry, they assert control over the military apparatus located on Russian soil.
The Soviet Union was being hollowed out from the inside by its own largest province.
And that rapid unraveling leads us directly to the death blow, December 1991.
The quiet, sudden, almost bureaucratic end to a 74-year-old superpower. There are no massive explosions, no dramatic last stands at the Kremlin walls.
Just a secret meeting in the freezing woods.
On December 8, 1991, the leaders of the three core Slavic republics, Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus, meet secretly at a secluded hunting lodge in the Belovezskaya Pushta forest.
Without Gorbachev's knowledge, and certainly without his consent, they draft and sign a simple document stating that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, ceases its existence.
They form a loose, toothless commonwealth of independent states in its place. Gorbachev, sitting in the Kremlin, is completely sidelined.
The military ignores his calls.
A few weeks later, bowing to the inevitable, on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev officially resigns on live television, and the red Soviet flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor.
It is one of the most surreal moments in modern history.
So let's step back and bring this historical autopsy to a close. How do we make sense of this?
The Soviet Union wasn't murdered by foreign powers winning the Cold War through force of arms, nor did it simply die of old age.
It was dismantled from the inside out. It was a perfect storm. The ideological collapse brought on by the sudden, traumatic truths of Glasnost, the catastrophic, incredibly naive economic miscalculations that destroyed the currency and emptied the grocery store shelves, and ultimately a fatal internal tug-of-war among the elites.
The military, the KGB, the factory bosses, the regional leaders, they all ultimately decided they preferred to break the state apart and seize their own independent fiefdoms rather than surrender their massive budgets and privileges to save the Union.
It remains perhaps the ultimate case study in institutional failure and the limits of reform. And it's important to note that historians and economists still fiercely debate the lessons of this collapse, and we want to present both sides of this debate impartially.
On the one hand, some scholars, often leaning to the right or favoring strong state capacity, argue that the USSR required authoritarian modernization.
They look at China and argue that if someone like Andropov had lived longer, or if Gorbachev had prioritized strict, brutal economic reform over political freedom, the state could have survived, modernized, and transitioned successfully into the 21st century.
On the other hand, many critics, often leaning to the left or focusing on the social cost, argue that it was the sudden, poorly planned rush toward market economics that killed the patient.
They argue the shock therapy of dismantling state controls and allowing private arbitrage before a true regulated market existed was what caused the devastating hyperinflation and the eventual collapse of living standards.
In this view, the capitalist reforms were the disease, not the cure. We aren't taking a side in that debate, but understanding those two distinct perspectives is absolutely central to understanding the complex legacy of 1991.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, slightly chilling, provocative thought.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think about this. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved in December 1991, the actual physical machinery of the state didn't disappear into thin air.
The massive concrete ministries in Moscow didn't crumble to dust.
The millions of intelligence officers and bureaucrats didn't vanish. The tens of thousands of nuclear weapons didn't evaporate. The geography didn't change.
They simply changed the letterhead on their official stationery.
They crossed out USSR and printed the Russian Federation. Yeltsin literally moved his staff into Gorbachev's old offices.
It leaves you wondering,
If the true underlying machinery of the empire, the vast security apparatus, the military-industrial complex, the deep-seated bureaucratic culture, was simply inherited and quickly rebranded by the Russian elite, did the Soviet state ever really collapse?
or did it just shed its outdated communist skin, going into a brief hibernation, waiting for a new era to be reinvented and reassert itself on the global stage?
It's a profound perspective, and it fundamentally reframes everything we think we know about the end of the Cold War. The specific Marxist-Leninist ideology died, but the deep structural bones of the imperial state remained largely intact, waiting to be animated by something else.
It's definitely something to think about.
See you next time with more such stories.